I have learned so much, again, not being remotely a scholar a credentialed scholar of late antiquity, long engaged with questions regarding the history of Christianity, to be sure, and in its fringes especially, but the illuminations, to repeat, of the presenters at this conference have been incredibly compelling. I have learned a great deal from so many of the contributors' articulations and analyses of Foucault's treatment of virginity and celibacy, not as reproducing, and indeed perhaps extremely importantly, not reproducing the stereotypical reading of Christianity as, at least of doctrinal Christianity, as proposing any kind of radical rupture between the flesh, the body, perhaps better, and the soul, with will, which I had never really read correctly, and will, on the instruction of so many of the speakers that we've had, now I hope read more correctly, not as a radical source of evil, but instead the particular mediating gift that the Christian God gave to his flock, his creation, in helping them exercise the appropriate relation between the soul and the flesh, particularly in this world, which clearly is Foucault's focus. I will say that among so many other themes, those that beyond virginality and celibacy that have been particularly salient to me in the conference, and perhaps it, undoubtedly shows my own biases, especially the late biases in my commentaries on Foucault, is first the rereading of Foucault's work with the historical figuration of madness, or rather, let me put it this way, rather more broadly, the backlooping that so many of the contributors have seen, something that they've seen with the great benefit of the fourth volume, extending as far back as Foucault's original engagement with the mad in the history of madness, and then perhaps more explicitly in his writings on psychiatric power in the early 1970s, before 1974, when people have spotted a particular research engagement with Christianity, but just so an engagement preceding that suggests that the figure of Christianity may have been more spectral, more haunting in Foucault's work than it is easy to recognize. I've cooked up these two terms for Foucault. One is Foucaultus absconditus, and the other is Foucaultus obliquus, Foucault, the hidden Foucault, and the oblique Foucault, which I think actually has been subject to clarification. Not the terms themselves, but Foucault, absconditus, Foucault obliquus, in the course of this conference. And I see a very significant opportunity to move that forward. And I do not mean for a moment any further engagement with the biography of Foucault and what people think they know about it. I mean an engagement with the thought itself and its motives, its grounds, and so on. The second a theme that has stood out for me, again, a theme that I have been preoccupied with in the last several years of engaging Foucault, is indeed confession, the confessional, and again, thank you, contributors, more than one, for reminding us that the theme of confession, of course, is not a theme that is restricted in Foucault's work to his treatment of Christianity, but instead extends into the secularization of confession, particularly as in the psychiatric relationship, the psychological relationship, a few other relationships, which he interestingly characterized in the Government of Self and Others at one little juncture as having become deeply restricted to the engagement with effectively credentialed experts, as opposed to an engagement that one could see in the classical world and the pagan world, and perhaps in some measure, though less, in the early Christian world between friends. And crucially, also between the self in its relation to itself, as we've had pointed out to us, sometimes a relation that was still conceived of as effectively integral synecdochically, but sometimes not. Sometimes conceived of a self split against itself. The theme of parrhesia, or parrhesia, however you want to pronounce it, has been central to this discussion. Also a concept and a theme of Foucault's work that I have been preoccupied with, understandably, as the rest of us have been. Clearly has to be folded into his treatment of the hermeneutics of the subject, of all of the work that he did, even in the end of the second volume of The History of Sexuality, treating the relationship between master and student. Much more briefly in The Government of the Self and Others in the first volume, in treating, which to my mind is an echo of Aristotle's treatment of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics, the relationship between friends who need the best of friends, who can be trusted to tell the truth to one another. So this is not really an issue of speaking truth to power. And as Daniele and I agreed in our two extended discussion with one another, reading parrhesia or reducing parrhesia as the dynamics of speaking truth to power, I think is a big mistake. And I think that we also must recognize that, again, that the engagement of the self with itself, the telling of the truth of the self to itself, has to be enfolded within larger consideration of parrhesia, and even if it somewhat stretches to the letter, Foucault's own engagement with the concept. And that's crucial to me for two reasons. One, because parrhesia occupies a very interesting place in the history of rhetoric in the classical period, and pagan. It was conceived of as anti-rhetoric, exactly what was not rhetorical, but this frank speech that rejected every attempt to persuade, but instead simply, in the rhetorical mode, of course, but instead simply stated frankly, or involved the frank statement of a speaker's convictions and critiques. Foucault slides rather too easily, in my mind, into semanticizing parrhesia as speaking the truth. And I think this is a problem that remains very much hanging in his last engagements with it, because it doesn't really address what many of us, I presume, would find deeply troubling engagements of such people as Holocaust deniers and so on. And there are, well, look at the period we've recently been living through, even more recently, that does not seem to involve deception, but instead an actual conviction on the part of the speaker that he or she or they are speaking truth to power. I think a way beyond this would be a way that focuses precisely on the parrhesia involved in the truth, the self speaking the truth to itself, which is no guarantee of the overcoming of dogmatisms of one sort or another, because as we all know, our capacity to reflect upon ourselves is always more limited than it might be. But I think that combining as a kind of trinity, these three dimensions of parrhesia, speaking truth to power, speaking truth to oneself and having to one's friend, and one's friend speaking a truth, or being parrhesiastic more precisely, to oneself, and the self being parrhesiastic to itself, might be able to allow us to come to a more complex resolution of the dynamics of parrhesia, which I also mentioned to Daniele, is operative as a concept in New Testament scholarship, very, very largely focusing upon Jesus of Nazareth, maybe come to a more complex relation to it than Foucault leaves us with, or was able to leave us with, in his last works. Finally, just let me add a couple of notes of non-notes, that is to say, notes that I did not hear in any of the talks. One of these is any explicit reference to what is enlightenment. I presume that most of the speakers, in their references to Foucault's conception of critique and to counterconduct, to all being governed but not being governed in this way, and engaging in a kind of critique and cultivating a kind of ethos of character that would always be putting into question the contemporary, the present conditions of governance, is indeed more a reference to the articulations we find in what the very late essay, of course, What is Enlightenment, rather than the much earlier essay or interview, really, double phase, that is called What is Critique? This, I think, is another way, the crucial points being made by several speakers that Foucault was in no way a platformist, and so should not be confused with anyone promoting one or another party or agenda of any kind of concretely doctrine or sort, but instead offering us a mode of being in the world, a mode of cultivating our being in the world that is indeed a matter of counterconduct with the inflection of a wisdom that I think we find as early as the introduction to Bataille's works, that any resolution of another way into especially some sort, even a very concrete mode of counterconduct, but all the more dangerously as an abstracted mode of counterconduct, is always in danger of becoming a law once again. And that what we need to be crucially sensitive to is what he reported to Paul Rabineau, and which I poached off of Paul Rabineau in one of my essays, that we should always be careful to watch out that in cultivating capacities and perhaps furthering our capacities, we do not reinforce our oppression. And that our, I would suggest, is global. And I think, for example, that Foucault's writing in the face of the Vietnamese Bow peoples coming to France is an excellent example of that. Niki, I have spoken much too long, and I very much want to hear your remarks, and I'm very sorry that I spoke first, and I told you I didn't want to, but anyway, you forced me, so it's your fault.
No, so we have a link to the problems in Johannesburg downtown. So the this is really unprecedented. However, for all the ways in which we've gotten to be connected to each other in this really terrible year, we have this this glitch, this little fissure, which I think might be in keeping with our broader ethos, right? So I'll just very quickly say, David Lay, during my session, asked me this one question, right? Why this Foucault now? So what is the occasion for this conference? The occasion for this conference was the publication in 2018 by Gallimard of this fourth volume in History of Sexuality, Les Aveux de la chair, which is magnificently edited by Frédéric Prost, and it's a beautiful critical edition. Yet, as Philippe Chevalier pointed out in his own talk, the glossiness of the cover allows us to think about this as a book, right, with closure that has its own constitution and fixity. When in reality, this entire conference has been an exploration of how the book is not the work that Foucault was working on, even because it doesn't include the materials he had at hand that he was using to edit, that he was continuing to rethink in the last months, if not last years of his life. It's also not fixed because there is no way in which we can understand Foucault's work as fixed and pin it down if we are to take up the ethos with which Foucault is writing. And I think this is one of the ways in which the engagement with the archive, the actual archives of Foucault, the Fonds Foucault and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, we have a set of boxes, I think 117 boxes with around 40,000 pages in it. Oh. But even in that scope, we don't have a sense of an answer in there. Instead, we have an archive that has its own rules and its own openness, and that I think I'm going to follow the wisdom of Lynn Hoffer on and say is necessarily going to keep an openness. It's going to maintain that sense of paradox. There is no answer in the archives, just like there was no answer to final Foucault in this book. Instead, we have the opening for more questions. We have the ability to critique certain points that are ossified in time. And we have the opportunity to also engage with the kind of critical ethos that Foucault sets up, not only within a particular academic register, but also to think about the political and ethical implications today. So why this Foucault in this conference? Well, it's because we have this Foucault, right, who is translated in 2021 as Confessions of the Flesh by Robert Hurley. And we have this sense of a Foucault that is speaking after death, a Foucault from the grave, a Foucault who is confessing his last words. And this is not the case. We do not have a Foucault. We do not have a confession. We do not have even a history of sexuality as completed through this volume. The volume in itself, Jim Bernauer and then Peter Brown and Liz Clark, actually, they all reflected on the seeming kind of conservativeness of the image, where you have clearly the rosary, which you can see on the back, but also the fact that it's serpentine, right? The fact that it is in itself suggestive of not only the gender dynamics and the tie back to Eden, but also the way in which sexuality is a part of this narrative. I'll conclude that by saying I think it's also clearly a pun on anal beads. However, we haven't mentioned that, so I feel like since this is actually a conference on sexuality, we should be frank about some of the other hermeneutic possibilities. But I think that sense of play, right, the sense of play with a history that looks deeply traditional, but is actually pretty explosive, or at least pushing against the norms according to which the discourse has been inscribed, is what we've been doing in each one of these sessions. We've been taking up a traditional narrative and we've been refusing to fix Foucault. We've been refusing to fix this work. And we've been refusing to say that Foucault meant one thing and that he can only speak to us in one way. This is why I thought it was so important to have a conference that is deeply interdisciplinary. So between Jim and myself, we have anthropology and religion, even internal to our own university. And I think that was the most important starting point, because if you're going to think about this kind of work of Foucault and what this work might say to us, there's a sense that any given discipline might take up this work and talk about the ways in which it can work with its methodologies or concepts and commitments, or doesn't work. And there might be a desire to have consensus, right, about what the field thinks they can do with Foucault. So instead, to have people whose own kind of normative commitments, whose own epistemic orientations are different across our series, has been a really rich way to allow us to have conversations, not only amidst each other through the chat or through the live voices, but also through this ongoing sense of what our research can be. The implications of this, right? Why this Foucault? Well, because he's going to be out there right now. People are using and misusing this narrative, right? People are going to continue their age-old trick of trying to make Foucault into the great villain whether it is the far right lambasting of his quote unquote woke ideology, or whether it is the designation of Foucault as the hero for Me Too and consent. He's not, right? This is not a text that is about consent. It adopts the normative subjectivity of a very, I think for the most part, cisgender elite male, and it does not allow for discourses about consent, even internal to the ways in which Foucault is describing marriage in this text of Augustine. So between the far-right mobilization against Foucault, against critique, against the very predicates of our disciplines as scholars within the humanities, within the social sciences, as cultural producers, as journalists, as people who are activists and policymakers and lawyers, that we have this entire array of disciplines and professions and orientations in the people who have been constituting not only the speakers in this series, but also the auditors, all of you who have been keeping up with this over time. We have people like David Chavez, who's been working on border issues between New Mexico and the United States, who was asking key questions of Martina Tazzioli the other day. We have so many people who are doing this work, not just from a conceptual perspective, but according to what Foucault can teach us today. And that means that I think we can take this as an opportunity to take the narrative back from either side. No Saint Foucault, no villain Foucault. Instead, the capacious ways in which Foucault can say so many things, can speak so many truths, and allow us to think differently in that charge to penser autrement, that charge to disrupt our traditional and quotidian patterns of thinking, to be able to start to see more clearly how the forms of violence around us have been normalized and how so many people have been made object instead of given the conditions for being subject, for allowing themselves to engage in the kinds of ethical possibilities Foucault is seeking in antiquity. Right? He's thinking through a way of how do we have a sense of resistance and counter-conduct internal to these societies. And he finds particular ways of thinking through this in antiquity, and they're fascinating. But antiquity is, the classical societies he's talking about are also slave societies. These are not neutral spaces. These are not neutral subjects. So the opportunity that we have now to use these Foucaults is one to take up the searchingness of his own inquiry, to refuse to fix the inquiry, to look for those sites of resistance, as Mark Jordan was showing us through his own talk, and how this counter-conduct is a constitutive part of Foucault's own turn to what bodies can do, how they can resist, and how we can think about the destabilization of norms. And so the why now-ness of it is part, how do we take Foucault back from the bad readings? But mainly it's how do we take Foucault to task for the ways in which his own reading is a function of his own situatedness, while also mobilizing the very genealogical spirit of inquiry and the very ethos with which he's challenged himself to seek out over his last decade, and challenges us today to think through in terms of our own forms of counter-conduct, our own articulations of resistance, and our own reckoning with the realities of power that are operating at a pitch right now that we can see on the geopolitical scale to the very local scale. So there are some real stakes for our inquiry, and the more that we can look at Foucault from these various perspectives, the more productive our own conversations can be. The more we can help our students see and think differently, the more that we ourselves can be different kinds of interlocutors, citizens, non-citizens, people. So to conclude, I'll just go very quickly through a few of the Foucaults, and then I don't think that Johannesburg Power is going to come back online, so I think that we'll wrap it up. So I will start by honoring each and every one of these participants. I am so deeply grateful to you all for taking the time, the care, and bringing the kind of brilliance and integrity that you have, as well as an openness and a sincere searchingness when it comes to taking up our friend Foucault and engaging each other on terms that are so charitable as well as critical. We started with Foucault the scholar, with the two people who knew Foucault, who helped engage Foucault in these inquiries in the late 70s and early 80s. With James Bernauer on our very first day and his articulation, A Fascinating Flesh, he helped us see Foucault in terms of the crises and the possibilities within Iran, helping us think about revolution in deeply political and embedded terms, and how Foucault's own desire to be introduced to experts on Christianity allowed for James Bernauer to bring Foucault into a conversation that was both historical, but also theoretical and theological. With Peter Brown, we have another scholar who is engaging Foucault, this time in Berkeley, on questions of shared interest, right? Why the history of sexuality? Why now? Why this, history of private life within the work of Paul Vane? Why does history matter to how we think today? And this is where we see some of the old Foucault in terms of the epistemic conditions of possibility, thought about now through a kind of historical a priori, right? Thinking through the historical conditions for how we have come to think and structure societies today. With Peter Brown, there's also a really fascinating set of direct influence and conversation, and the way in which they're meeting from 1980 at the Howison Lectures in Berkeley till the penning of Les Aveux, where Foucault is continuing to read through Brown's work on Augustan sexuality. Shows how there's this dialectical engagement between this philosopher, this genealogist of subjectivity, Foucault, and this historian, this person who's creating and helping forge a certain kind of temporality and helping us think through what it means to be a person, a Christian, a pagan, philosopher, and monk in late antiquity, as Peter Brown so movingly showed. Our second week allows us to think through the second aspect, which is Foucault as researcher. This is where the brilliant account of Philippe Chevalier, the genesis of Les Aveux, he takes us through the three different stages that he's gleaned in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And he allows us to think through how the text of Les Aveux changes over time, how Foucault shifts his inquiry from the projected 6 series to the published 4, and how Foucault's own thinking through Christianity moves from an earlier volume, volume 2, Le Cher et le Corps, on 16th to 17th, 18th century confessional practices and manuals and sexual ethics to a certain extent, and turns to late antiquity, the 2nd to 5th centuries, very different set of Christian figures in a domain of thinking through what is it to tell the truth about oneself? Why are we compelled to tell this truth? How are certain kinds of confessional dynamics shaped in this late ancient milieu in a way that then becomes institutionalized in the history of Catholicism and then creates the conditions for how we think about contemporary discourse and disciplinary subjectivity today. Philippe Chevalier is also an expert in Kierkegaard, and I think that this is the way in which we can take up his language of stages, because just as with Kierkegaard, there isn't a neat temporal or teleological progression, but instead these stages themselves are deeply messy. And so too do I think the way in which we are coming to Foucault as researcher, as I showed in my own talk, is to think about how Foucault is working through these questions. He's working through different archives. He's working through different texts and possibilities. And he's allowing his own mind to be changed. He's changed by the materials that he reads. And this not only changes his reading of Augustine or of Ignatius, it also changes the way in which he reads his own history, in which he understands and starts to understand how the genealogy of the present, or genealogy of subjectivity, which is a history of our present, requires a longer sense of thinking through how the conditions were shaped, not only that have led us to contemporary forms of domination that produce the biopolitical norms that regulate carceral society and allow for serious problems today. It also allows him to go back and think through what are the possible conditions for resistance, the conditions for self-formation, the conditions for our own self-shaping as a way to engage in the critique of the broader norms, to challenge those very institutions of power, and to think through how we might move forward. We saw this very logic unfolded beautifully in the work of Foucault as poet, in both the talks of Mark Jordan, who's bringing us Lust in Paradise, as well as Lynn Hopper, who gives us brilliant form of chiasmic reading. And both Mark and Lynn help us think through resistance as eros, and the way that bodies and the archive themselves have to be destabilized. And so the kind of neat picture where I like the periodization of Foucault because I think it helps us think through Foucault and what he's up to in a way that is illustrative of what his own process looks like. But we don't want to fix that kind of periodization. And instead, we want to allow the archives to speak back, to disturb our expectations and assumptions, and to resist the kind of capture that we have now understood Foucault. Instead, if we read Foucault as poet, we have to be cast back into that space of alterity. We have to live in that paradox and resist a sense of being able to say what he said and instead live as he calls us to do, which is to live differently in ways that cannot be seen in advance. The next category, Foucault as, I'm just gonna say Foucault as man. And I'm gonna lump together here the brilliant work of Liz Clark and Arianna Spazzini, because both treat the way in which women in Foucault's work exposes just how masculinist the register is that Foucault is thinking through. And Liz brilliantly helps us think through not only how do Foucault's own readings of Augustine grant too much charity to Augustine, but Liz also helped us think about how Augustine, in his own construction of marriage and women, has reverberated through our traditions and have continued to enact violence against women. And so the way in which these figures speak is not a question of history, it's a question of the contemporary political questions, should we choose to take them up. Arianna Spazzini is thinking through these questions of how do we actually articulate a better construction of resistance in these virgins? How do these women actually help us think through the logic that Foucault is after but does not bring to the page? And I thought it was a gorgeous performative treatment as well. Finally, we have Foucault as critic, or how we might think of Foucault as parrhesias, but the Foucault who is calling us to engage in a critical method, as Daniele Lorenzini was talking through, right? Beautifully unpacking the way in which critique, the critical attitude, is a part of Foucault's last decade and the kind of method that we might take up today in order to not do violence to what Foucault is saying, and also to refuse to follow any orthodoxies that have been set out in advance. Right? Foucault does not want us to worship him. Foucault does not want us to do what he says. That is very un-Foucauldian. So we ourselves can forge this critical attitude. And Martina Tazzioli was brilliantly helping us think through how the asylum regime in itself encodes the need for its critique. We need to be able to see the way in which the asylum regime, the way in which asylum seekers and refugees have been not only subjected to violence in their home conditions, but continue to be subjected to the logic that Martina was bringing in through Frantz Fanon's colonial subject, where a subject is not assumed to be capable of telling the truth. They will be under the guise of suspicion. And this raises that vital question, who gets to count as a subject, who gets to announce their truth? It is seen as confession in Foucault as a site of violence and domination, certainly, right? Being compelled to tell the truth of oneself, whether we're at the doctor's office or the shrink or the school. These are forms of disciplinary power, right? These are the means by which we're regulated as subjects today. However, there is an additional sense of the geopolitical frame, the way in which we are shaped through conditions that are global now, that have the kind of technological and bureaucratic movements to cover over their own operations even more effectively than before. And as this last year, as we exist in COVID times, as we exist in a period of never-ending war, we have so many more reasons to understand how our confinement, our isolation correlates with an increased disenfranchisement of power of voice, and therefore the ability to critique. And so with Achille Mbembe today, not today, never today, always today, thinking through a different temporality of the way in which his own engagement with Foucault's biopolitics, and thinking through this in terms of the necropolitics, particularly against the formerly colonized people. This is where we can think about Foucault in his own ethos as a philosopher, as activist. We can think about what Foucault himself would be arguing for and mobilizing for. How would he call out carceral society, mass incarceration, police brutality, the destabilization of so many countries that create the conditions for the refugee crisis, famine, climate change, and collapse. We have so many issues that are so present today, and they're not separate. They're all part of these broader machines of truth, of power. And the question is, can we also think through the possibility for our own ethics, not just to take care of ourselves, but to help constitute a more critical force, a more critical way of being that pushes back and destabilizes and changes those very conditions of power and violence in order to actually live up to the democratic possibilities that we might also have. So I want to thank once again everyone who has actually been at the heart of this operation. Elias Bongba, our wonderful chair, all of my colleagues in the Department of Religion and the University of Rice. Ozioma, thank you so much for being our tech support. Diana Hurd for herding us through every single one of these webinars. Marcy Newton for making sure that people get paid. Not to mention the HRC, Adriana, Ferez, and Melissa. We have so many people who have been doing this work, not only over the last month, but over the last 2 years, since this has been a conference that has been many years in the making, since it was originally planned for in-person April 2020. I'm very grateful to be able to engage more people, to be able to open the conversation to the future as well as the present, and to break through the walls of the university. Because I think this is what we can do today. This is how we can take up the work, not just keep it on Twitter. We can also take it up within our academic work. We can take it up in our policy work. We can take it up in our activist selves. We can think through the multiple domains that we have been encountering of Foucault's and understand that kind of capaciousness as ones we ourselves can inhabit. So I will close by thanking my wonderful co-host again, Jim Faubion. I'm so grateful for you for walking with me.
Brilliant. And what I would also say is that it is an extraordinary entree into an introduction to a volume that I think absolutely must be produced. It's not just a choice. I'm sorry, contributors. No, you're under subjugation now. And you're under self-subjugation because you have all presented such compelling contributions to Foucault we have not seen adequately at all previously. Again, readings that are revisionary, if not revisionist, but also an engagement with critique and engagement with Foucault's strengths and limitations as an historian, and engagement with his so many personae, but also with, as Niki has so articulately put it, the relevance of what, the contemporary relevance of what might at first sight seem to be an historical installment without any echo in the present. But as we know, Foucault never undertook historical research simply to have it be antiquarian. And even if he was unable to finish his project, bring it back up to the present, which I suspect he wanted to do, it is thus left for all of the people that we have heard from, but especially the younger scholars, all of whom are brilliant. Niki, you're brilliant. The rest of the last of you in this series have been incredibly compelling in your insights and the acuity of your analyses. And this simply has to move forward as a volume. And I hope all of the participants in this conference will agree with me that you have no choice. You simply must do it.
Well, thank you so much. We'll end on that note of subjection. And simply thank you all.
Thank you all also. It's been an extraordinary, illuminating series of events. Wonderful. And Niki, last of all, but not at all least, thank you.
To the future.